Okay, so the last thing that we really saw, we were learning about the law of, taking who's responsible in situations where in a public area, um, someone gets damaged or someone gets injured from something that I've left out in a public area. And in relation to that discussion, we saw in the Biurim that Rav Stern had talked about what would be the halacha if a waiter slips and pours something on someone's clothes and damages their clothes. And it turned out that there are so many different factors that are involved. What was the condition of the floor, and was there time for the guest in the restaurant to move out of the way or not? And a person who slips is not called a posheya. And he had raised the fact that there's a stira between two piskei halacha. One in one place, in Shulchan Aruch Siman Shin Ayin Ches, that if a person slips and falls on a utensil and breaks it, he's liable to pay for the thing that he broke because he slipped and fell. But then in another place in Shulchan Aruch, if a person slips and falls with an object in his hand and that object goes ahead and damages other people, then you're going to be patur because you're not called the posheya, you're not called negligent. And so it seemed to be that there's a contradiction. And there were a number of different ways of answering that question. And he said that the Aruch HaShulchan says that the difference is that it depends if you damage a person versus damage property. That would be one difference. But then he said there could be other differences as well. So remember, this is a very complicated area of halacha. It's not simple, but when a waiter or waitress slips and causes, let's say, spillage on a person's coat, it really is a question in halacha that remains unresolved because of the multiple factors that could be involved. And probably it's wisest, for the sake of customer service, for the proprietor to pay for the cleaning bill. Okay, we're going to see a related halacha now today. We're in Sif Chaf Beis in the Rav Shulchan Aruch. And the psak is as follows: Hagoder gidro bekotsim samach l'rishus harabim. A person builds a wall made out of thorns. Today, that would be what we would call barbed wire. Okay, you make a fence that is made out of a sharp object because you want to keep people away, right? You want to keep animals and you want to keep people away. The only problem is that you've built this wall adjacent to a public thoroughfare, right where people are walking. It could be an open marketplace for all we know. So the halacha is tzarech litzamtzeim shelo yetze kotz l'rishus harab. You have to be careful that thorns do not protrude out into rishus harabim. And the reason is pen yazik, because if this causes damage, then you could be liable. But as long as you keep it on your property, you are not in violation of halacha, which means that even though someone may inadvertently bump up against your wall and injure themselves or their property, nevertheless, you can claim I'm patur because you walked onto my property and not the other way around. So that's the letter of the law. That's the letter of the law. Hasidus, but it is considered to be an act of piety. Lahatznia adam kotzav ushar kol davar hamazik, that a person should hide away anything that, even on his own property, that could cause damage. In other words, yes, technically, if I wanted to put a pit with spikes on the bottom in my backyard, no one could hold me liable, right? Because it's my own property. What business do you have doing on my property? But piety demands, Hasidus demands, that a person put away or cover up or hide anything that could potentially cause damage to other people, even if it's on his own property. Shelo yavo mehem takala, so that no damage come from them. Kagon shiashlichem lenahar o yisrafem. So one eitzah would be to throw them in the river or to burn them. This happens. What I was thinking of when I immediately saw this halacha was a firearm, a weapon, right? You see how many times, unfortunately, at least in the U.S., children find a weapon that belongs to their parents and they play with it because it wasn't properly locked up, and tragedy can happen because if you keep a source of damage on your property, tragic things can happen. Who's liable in that situation? Well, the government says that you're liable if you keep a firearm on your property and it wasn't properly secured and it wasn't properly locked up. That they're very strict laws here, especially in Canada, that if you own a firearm and it goes off accidentally and injures someone, even on your own property, you will be held liable, criminally liable. But that's not the letter of the halacha. The halacha states that anything that happens on your property, you cannot be held liable, even if it's a source of damage. Okay. Now, obviously, there's going to be a difference. There could be a difference if someone is invited onto your property and is not disclosed that there's a pit with spikes in the back of and you put like a little blanket on it and you say, here, please walk with me over here. Look at my new lawn or whatever. Right. So that's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about here is that you want to make sure that even when something is on your own property, the public will not get injured, the unknowing public. So therefore, even though technically you're allowed to have a barbed wire fence that could potentially injure people, Amidas Chasidus says, why would I want people to get damaged because of something that I have constructed? And therefore, piety would say, stay away from such a thing. So let's take a look at the Imrei Yaakov in the bottom of the page. Shelo Yetze coats. You have to be careful that thorns do not protrude outwards, and afilu ma'at. They can't even protrude outward to Rishus Harabim even slightly. Ve'im huzku bahem chayev nezek shalei. But if that does happen, and damage is caused because I had something protruding into the public and it caused damage, I have to pay full damages. So anything that is sticking out of my property that people trip over or that people get damaged by, I have to pay for. Aval im godar b'tzimtzum b'toch reshuto patur. But if a person measures really carefully where the property line is, and he puts up the thorn mamish right up to the property line, and someone, because they're walking and they're not careful, or there's a lot of foot traffic or whatever it is, moves over and goes into my property and scrapes themselves or their clothing, then I'm going to be patur. Because it's not considered to be the norm for people to rub up against private walls. Umidas chasidus, but it is considered to be piety to always make sure that even on your own property, there's not a source of damage like thorns. Ve'al kayotze bazeh amru beperak haminiach haman deboy lemihavi chasida lekayamili denazikin. And about this kind of thing, the Gemara says that if a person wishes to be pious, he should fulfill matters of damages, mili denazikin, meaning that a person should always try to strive to never be a source of injury or damage. Try to the best of your ability. Drive carefully and be cautious with, a pet that you may have that could be a source of injury to others. And make sure that your property is well kept so that people don't trip over things that are on your property and so forth and so on. Lahatzniya adam kotzav, a person should, a chassid should hide away his thorns. Isa b'shulchan aruch arachayim siman shin ches if yud ches. This is a halacha in Hilchos Shabbos that the kotes hamunach b'rishus harabim mutar l'taltalo b'Shabbos pachos midalad amos. That even though a thorn may normally be considered muktzah, you are, however, allowed to move it in a rishus harabim if it's a source of damage. Uva Carmelis mutter letaltalo beheja. And in a Carmelis, which is a rabbinic public area, you're allowed to move it even without any consideration to carrying whatsoever. And the reason is mishum dechayshinan shemayuz kubo rabin, because we're concerned that people will be damaged. So, for example, if you see glass, broken glass, on Shabbos, on the street or on the sidewalk, and you're worried that someone's going to step on it, you are permitted to pick it up, even though it's muktzah. You're allowed to move it to wherever you feel you need to move it. The laws of muktzah and the laws of all rabbinic prohibitions are suspended in order to protect the public from a public hazard. Because whenever damage is prevalent or might come up, the rabbis did not impose their restrictions. You may remember this from Hilchos Muktzah, Brian. Who else is in Smichas Chaver here? I'm trying to, Brian, Barry. So you may remember this from Smichas Chaver last semester when we did before the summer, right? We did Muktzah. Last year we did Muktzah, and so we learned about all of these halachas, and we learned that a source of damage, sort of, you have a carte blanche to move it in an area like our streets. Okay. Oh yeah, Izzy, you also a Smichas Chaver guy. Okay, so that's all of the Imrei Yaakov on the Sif, but there's a really big piece in the Biurim. Now, so first of all, if you take a look at the bottom in the Biurim on the previous page, he says, "Tzarech litzamtzem shelo yetze kotz." You have to be very careful that your thorns do not protrude into the public area. So he quotes the Shulchan Aruch in Siman Tov Tes Vav Sif Aleph, the Imgader bekotzim betzimtzum betzoch reshuto patur. That as long as the thorn fence or the barbed wire fence does not go past your property line, you will be exempt from any damage that is caused thereby. Why? Because people don't normally rub up against the wall. And it's from a Gemara in Bava Kama that says so explicitly. But here's the thing: what about a person who has property or an animal, like you're a donkey driver and you're leading your donkey or a camel through the public thoroughfare? Camels sometimes do rub up against walls. The Gemara even says that there's a form of damage called shame, where an animal will have an itchy back and will scratch itself against the wall. So uvesefer minchas pitim ala shulchan aruch sham kasav de behema shuhuz kanir lechora dechayev. The haderech behema liitchachech bakotlin kamasha kasav harash v'huva b'shach yeradea simen nun aleph ad kan l'shana aminchas pitim. So the Sefer Minchas Pitim, which is a relatively recent Sefer, probably I think either 19th or 20th century, I don't recall. He says that since it is normal for an animal to rub itself against the wall, you would be liable if you're adjacent to a public thoroughfare where people lead their animals. You would be liable or even let's say a pet dog. My pet dog goes up and it walks. When people walk their dog, they're not so careful to make sure that the animal doesn't walk on someone else's lawn, right? And people generally accept that. People don't get upset if I'm walking my dog. As long as the dog doesn't poop on my lawn, I'm okay, right? So what happens if my dog goes up against the wall, has an itch, and starts scratching itself and actually injures itself? So the Minchas Pitim says you'll be liable even if the thorns are on your property, but since it's normal for animals walking through Rishus Harabim to rub up against walls that are adjacent to the Rishus Harabim, you're going to be chayav. Aval matzasi biyam shel shlomo bava kama sham shekasav degam behema patur. But I see that this is a machlokus. The Maharshal, who was I think either 16th or 17th century, says you're going to be patur in that situation. Bizel l'shona, and he says as follows. He says, with humans, you're certainly patur because people don't normally go and rub up against the wall. Kolomar shielchu bekarov lakotel mamish shedoma lechichuch. People are not going to walk mamish right up to a wall. Ve'im hu holechu mishane ba'atzmo upater ba'al hagader. And if a person does that and he injures himself, the owner of the wall is putter because that's not normal human behavior. And then he says, "V'lav dafka b'nei adam," but this doesn't just apply to humans. Ela afilu behema gamkein ein darko lahaloch kol kach karov lakotel. He says that animals also do not normally walk up so close to a wall. And even though we know that there's a form of damage the animals cause to rub up against walls because they have an itch, but that when an animal doesn't have an itch, in other words, it's not considered normal for animals to behave in this way. There are times when animals depart from the norm and they will rub themselves against the wall, but that's still considered to be abnormal. And if the animal does choose to rub itself against the wall, it's made its own choice, and you can't hold the barbed wire fence owner to be liable. Today, I would imagine that there's probably laws about barbed wire fences. In other words, you're not allowed to, David, maybe you can clarify, you're not allowed to build a fence that you can only do the top part that's higher than a certain amount. That's allowed to be barbed wire? Or is there any restriction on it? David?
No, I haven't heard of seeing barbed wire at all. There are height restrictions. No, but I'm pretty sure that barbed wire would not be allowed.
Barbed wire is not allowed at all in Canada?
I'm not saying it to Canada. Obviously, there's certain security areas where you probably have exemptions where you can put it, but in a residential area, I've never
area, you're saying?
Never seen anything like that.
No,
it depends how many volts. Yeah. Right. Is there any restriction on electrified fences?
I would imagine the same thing would apply, even more so for electrified fences.
Okay.
Yeah. When it comes to residential, the rules are like very, very.
I'm saying, but what if I'm walking down Bathurst or Steeles and someone's got a warehouse and they want to protect it from theft. Aren't they allowed to put up a barbed wire fence?
So I guess it would be certain businesses. I mean, it has to be certain business. I mean, we're just speculating, or I'm just speculating right now. I mean, there certainly would be certain businesses that would be allowed to have certain, extra high fences because of what's being done on the property. Obviously, there's certain regulations that would have to be in place to warn people of the danger that's there.
Moish, you don't have a barbed wire fence. There's it's not something that people typically see. LA, I see it all over. Yeah. I heard a Jackie Mason joke about a Puerto Rican winning the Olympics and wraps himself in the barbed wire. I don't remember what it was, but anyway, it was the okay.
Protecting your house, or you're allowed to have it, or you're not allowed to have it.
So the Shulchan Aruch says it is permitted as long as the protection device is on your property. It's permitted. I would imagine in South Africa, you've got it. Yeah, it's a rough neighborhood.
Even from Mexico, you need a minimum height for it. You cannot put it very low because
because people can injure themselves. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. All right. Okay. So, but again, would I want to be responsible for someone's damage? That's midas chasidus. That's right. An act of a pious person says, even though halacha permits me, I wouldn't want someone to get damaged by something that's on my property, right? So again, you have to balance that with wanting to protect your property. Not a very simple matter. I think if I was living in Johannesburg, I would not hesitate to put barbed wire on my property based on what I hear, right?
It's included already when you buy it.
Oh, it's included.
Part of it.
Right.
So I just found something. It says your barbed wire is typically prohibited in Ontario from being used in commercial and residential zones. So that's just a general comment. I don't see that.
Wow. Okay. Everyone can hear David? Yeah. Okay.
But I'd have to look deeper into actual code requirements regarding it. But as a general statement, it's not allowed.
Interesting. Listen, there's some benefits in living in Ontario, right? Crime rates are low, Baruch Hashem. Kenai Hara. Okay, Pen Yazik, let's take a look at this one. This is a very long piece. We're going to start it today, and we'll see how far we get into it. It's a very important piece. V'yesh lodun odot mi sheyatsa im richbo al manat lahatzilat hanefesh. Let's look at the following shaila. Guy gets in his car, and he has an emergency. He's going to save someone's life. Kagon chaver hatzala uchadom. Let's say he's a member of Hatzala, or he's an ambulance driver. V'toch kedei nesiato paga v'hizik lacher. And while he's driving, because he's going to save the world, he goes and injures somebody else. Ha'im yesh tzad lepotru min l'shalem et hanezek, hoel v'yatza kedei lahatzil et hanefesh. Is there any argument to justify saying that he's exempt because he was on a mission from God, as they say, right? He was going out to save a life. So can you argue that maybe this would be a reason to exempt him? So before we can even try to explain this shaila, ra'ui lahakdim, first we have to sort of build our structure, right? He says, first of all, that any driver who injures or causes damage over the course of his driving, even though he did it completely without intention, and he was being generally responsible in his driving, but accidents happen. Accidents happen to everybody. So therefore, nonetheless, he's liable to pay. Ve'enu yachol liton shehanizik hayatzarach lizoher ba'atzmo kishehu over bakvish. And he cannot say, oh, it was the pedestrian had to watch himself when he was crossing the street. That's not an excuse. And that's true in Ontario. It's true in California. I don't know if it's true in New York City. I think in New York City, they say, you cross the street at your own peril. But generally in halacha, a person who's driving bears the responsibility. Chutz im zemikra shel oines gomer, v'chedekasva hapoiskim ein Imrei Yaakov sif aleph ein kan makom laharich bazeh. But that's excluding a situation of complete onus, where a pedestrian just jumps into the street, right, in the midst of moving traffic, right? So that's not the norm. The norm is that the driver bears the responsibility. The Rush, who lives 800, 900 years ago, he has the following shaila. A guy is riding on his horse. And he crashes into another guy who's riding his horse. Because of al zeh harash v'zelashona, ma shetoin hamazik shehupata lefi shahaya b'rishus harabim b'hayalo rishus larutz. He says the mazik is arguing, I was in a public thoroughfare, and everyone knows that people run, go fast with their horses. So if I was galloping on my horse, the guy that I crashed into should have been more careful. He should have watched where he was going. He says, "V'hayalo l'nizak lishmor atzmo," and the damagee should have watched himself. Lav tainahu. He says that's not a valid claim. And she'ein lo larutz b'rishus harabim afilu adam b'raglav. because no one should be running in a public thoroughfare. Even a human being on his own feet should not be running in a public thoroughfare. Ela kedei sheyuchal la'amod kishiyirtzeh. A person has to be able to stop. When a person is moving, he has to be able to stop instantaneously in order to be exempt from damages that are caused by his motion. So basically the Rush proves this, that if a person is running, and so many times when you run, you can't stop instantaneously, and if you do, you're going to be liable. So kol shekain harochev al hasus she'en lo reshus larutz b'makom shebnei adam rochvin shema lo yichal la'amod kishiyirtzeh. And so the Rush says the same is true for a person who's galloping on a horse. He says, since you won't be able to stop instantaneously if someone gets in your way, you're going to be liable, or because you shouldn't have been galloping. Uposheyahu umazik begufahu, and therefore you're considered negligent, and you are a damager with your own person. Kevin shuhu rochev al behema behizik begufa behema o begufav ukaf she'aleha kemazik begufa dami ad kan l'shana. He says any damage that you cause either with the animal or with the saddle, right, is considered to be damaging with your own body, because all of these things are ancillary to the rider. And that's a direct quote from the Rush, and the Huadak b'Shulchan Aruch Siman Shinayim Ches Siftes. And this is codified in Shulchan Aruch. Harei mavur b'divrei harash she'ein harochev yochol liton shehanizik hayatzarach lishmar atzma min hanezek. So the driver can never say the pedestrian should have watched where he was going. Ela harochev chayav lizaher lirkov ba'ofen kazeh sheyuchal la'atzor lahamid atzmo b'shat hatzorach. So the answer is, or the reason is because a driver has to be able to stop on a dime whenever something gets in the way. V'hainu ma shekorem hayom b'chukei hatenua shmirat merchak. He says, and this is what he's speaking in Eretz Yisrael in the 1980s, I think. He says, this is what they call today in the laws of traffic laws, shmirat merchak, that you have to keep a safe distance. And that's the law in most places, that you as a driver have to sort of have a safe buffer of space between you and everything else that's around you. Shechayav hanahag linsah ba'ofen kazeh sheyuchal la'atzor, so that you have the ability to stop in cases of emergency. V'lo lifkoa berechav shelafanav, and not to crash into the car that's in front of you. Right? So we know that if the car in front of you stops suddenly and you rear end the vehicle, so then you're generally going to be chayiv because you're the moving vehicle and the other car is stationary. And if you, for whatever reason, even though the guy abruptly stopped, but you didn't keep a safe distance between yourself and the guy in front of you, and you end up rear-ending him, so you're going to be chayiv. Af imhu yitzarech la'atzor ba'ofan pitomi, even if you have to stop suddenly. Bimlo nisar chayavhu benezek shehizik lachavero, and if you don't, if you didn't have that safe space, then you're going to be liable. Okay, so far what we're seeing should not be shocking to us. This seems to be pretty reasonable halacha, right? It's in consonance with probably most traffic laws in most places, that whoever's moving at fast speeds is the one who's going to be liable compared to the person who's traveling at a lower speed. But up until now, what we've been discussing is a person who's traveling in a car without having an emergency to save a life. If he says, but if you're traveling to save a life, maybe there's more room to have some gray area and not be so certain. There's a Gemara in Bava Kama that states as follows: the Tanya Isi ben Yehuda Omer, Ratz Chayav Mipnei Shehu Mishuneh. That if a person is running through Rishus Harabim, in the course of running, he bumps into something or someone and causes damage, so he's going to be liable. And the reason why he's liable is because He's departing from the normal speed of how you move in Rosh Hashanah. Umoda isi be'erev Shabbos bein hashmasha shehu pater. But then Isi says that if you're running on Erev Shabbos to get home in time for Shabbos, and in the course of your running you bump into something or someone and cause damage, then you're going to be pater. Mipnei shehu ratz b'reshus adkan. Because it is, you are running with permission. In other words, you are granted, the public grants you permission, or the halacha grants you permission to run to make it home in time for Shabbos. Well, certainly not the way I see some people driving, right? Right? So we have to all be careful, right? Now, first of all, the question is why? So we have to, it's a very vague Gemara, and we're going to have to spend some time unpacking this Gemara and trying to understand why the halacha on Erev Shabbos is different from any other time you're running through Rosh Hashanah. So we'll hold it here, and we'll continue this discussion with Choshen tomorrow. Okay. Have a good day.